Hi guys, welcome back to the second week of our video lectures. This week we're going to be talking about really the second New Deal, the real meat portion of FDR's legislation during the Great Depression, and we're also going to begin talking about World War II. Okay, so let's get going here. This is our March 30th video lecture, and like I said, today we're going to be talking about the second New Deal. Okay, so let's move on to slide number 2. Once FDR became president, it was really a situation in which the nation as a whole was moving in a more progressive manner. And in June of 1934, he would ask a very simple question, a question that really all incumbents ask when they're running for public office, right? Are you better off than you were last year? Well, for many, many Americans, the answer to that question was yes, right? And when the answer to that question is yes, you're much more inclined to stick with the steady leadership. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was wildly popular. And because of that, not only would you see him go to a second re-election, but the House of Representatives and the Senate would have massive blue waves, right, leading the way for what would become really the most progressive era in our country's history. Okay, so moving on to slide number 3. When you have such sweeping election results, you really have what's known as a public mandate. So, in essence, the public believes in your cause so much, and you can tell from the election results. The results are obvious that the country wants certain types of legislation. Well, when you have that public mandate, you're going to push for really your wish list of items, right? The things that you want the most. Well, this sound victory would allow him to do that. Now, FDR shifted his focus from recovery to social and economic reforms. One of the largest reforms that we're going to see is the Social Security Act. And the Social Security Act is going to change really not only the fundamentals of life in the 1930s, but it's going to have an impact even on our lives today. All right, so moving on to slide number 4, you can see a couple examples of political cartoons at this time. This really was a golden age for political cartoons. Now, the one that you notice on the left is a good example of FDR's willingness to try a number of different strategies. He was not married to any one program. He was not married to any one idea. He was willing to try numerous different solutions to the problem. Right now, that frustrated a lot of conservatives because some of the policies he tried just simply didn't work. Some of them worked very well, but some of them didn't, right? And if you look at the cartoon on the right, you'll see where FDR is holding a bowl, and within that bowl it says power, right? Really, the larger the government became, conservatives were genuinely worried that FDR was consolidating more and more and more power around the executive. And you can see the Congress is shown as a chef, almost a small chef, not really able to stop, right? He's got to keep feeding FDR more and more and more and more power. Again, though, the public mandate is in large part why this happened. Okay, so what was the big bill? Congress passed FDR's Emergency Relief Appropriation Bill in the spring of 1935. Now, this allowed for nearly $5 billion in new spending. Now, this is $5 billion in 1935. That is a tremendous amount of commitment from the federal government at that time. All sorts of new spending all over the country to try and get people back to work. Well, one of these programs that really did take off during this time was known as the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA. Prior to the REA, only about 20% of our farms had the use of electricity. Right now, we think about all the things that we use electricity for in our lives today, right? Without electricity, this video lecture wouldn't be possible. Without electricity, we wouldn't have the internet, and just so on and so forth, right? That electricity is really a fundamental pillar of our life today. Well, in the 1930s, our farms, only about 20% of them had access to uh, electricity. Now, by the end of the program, around 90% of our country would have access, or rather, our farming industry would have access to electricity. This was essential because it allowed you to expand your food web all around the country. Okay, moving on to the next slide, slide number 6. So the WPA puts creators back to work. One thing that always takes a hit when the economy is struggling are the creative individuals, right? Think about how difficult it is for a musician right now. You can't play a concert, right? There are no gigs, right? Really, when we start to see economies and cultures flourish is when there is an investment in the arts. Eleanor Roosevelt understood this, and in the Big Bill, there was a piece known as the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. Now, the WPA initiated art ventures at the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt and hired unemployed artists to paint murals in public buildings. Now, it wasn't just artists, it was also, like I said, musicians, writers, what have you. The creative individuals in our society were tapped for work, right? Because the Great Depression didn't just affect one type of job, it affected all types of jobs, including the creative sector. All right, now moving on to the next slide. These are some examples of Great Depression art. As you can see, the emotion in them is obvious, right? The dark tones, the really melancholy feeling that you get around these paintings. You'll also notice the rigidity of the paintings. Right? Let's move on to slide number 8. You can notice how sharp the edges are in these paintings, right? We say a lot of times, tough times don't last, tough people do. Well, you can really feel it in the art, right? The men and women that are in the art have very rigid edges, right? They seem strong, very strong. Just look at the two examples where you have the men who are building the building. You see the teacher with her students. You see the jazz that is happening at the time. It's just really rigid in nature, and it's showing you that even in these hard times, these men and women are strong. Okay, moving on to slide number 9. So naturally, all of this government spending caused significant debate on Capitol Hill. The WPA would generate a great amount of controversy. Now, many conservatives denounced the program's cost, uh, while labor unions attacked it for depressing our wage rates. Now, despite these criticisms, the program continually expanded. Here's where it becomes very difficult to argue against the WPA. By 1936, 7% of the American workforce was employed by the WPA. So, yes, the program may have been expensive. Yes, people may have been concerned about the amount of money that was being spent through these programs. But when you consider the fact that 7% of our entire workforce was employed by the WPA, it's very difficult to argue that that wasn't a sound program. Okay, moving on to slide number 10. Naturally, with all of these new pieces of legislation, the Supreme Court is going to want a say. They are going to have concerns about what exactly FDR is trying to get passed. Now, the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on a number of New Deal policies. In 1935, they would actually weigh in on a case that had to deal with the federal government wanting to regulate the production of chicken. They felt like that was a little too intrusive. Now, the next year, the Supreme Court terminated the Agricultural Adjustment Act on the grounds that the law to regulate what was simply too far of a reach for the federal government, right? And it would lead to a really key piece of the Second New Deal being struck down. Okay, now Roosevelt would fume that the court had created no man's land where no government, state or federal, could act effectively. Okay, now that's going to conclude our lesson for today. Go ahead and finish up your notes, guys. But once you are done with notes and you feel comfortable, you can move on to our March 31st video lecture. Stay safe. I hope you're well, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.